My name's Andy Lester. I want to welcome you to this special event here, and thank you all for coming. I'm not going to take up too much of your time because I want to get to the meat of the program, but I have a couple of things I'd like to say just to get started here. First of all, I'd like to tell you briefly about the Federalist Society. The Federalist Society for Law and Public Policy is a group of lawyers who are primarily, but certainly not exclusively, conservative and libertarian, who are interested in the current state of the legal order. It was founded in 1982. In fact, our speaker, Judge Silberman, was highly involved in the founding of the Federalist Society, but it was founded on several campuses back in 1982, several law school campuses. And within a few years, as the students who founded it graduated from law school and got into the profession, the Federalist Society expanded from the law schools, and lawyer chapters throughout the country were started. Currently, there are about 65 chapters nationwide. The Oklahoma City chapter is one of the younger ones, although no longer the youngest chapter. And we have been in existence here for about 3 years. I want to take a moment to mention a group that very graciously moved their meeting, which was also scheduled for today, and I know there are a number of members of the Christian Legal Society who are here today. At our request, they were gracious enough to move their meeting. I do want to announce for those of you who are interested that they will be meeting tomorrow here at the Petroleum Club. Former State Senator Howard Hendrick, the current director of the Department of Human Services, will be speaking. The program starts, the lunch starts, I believe, at 11:45, and the program will start at 12:30. I want to take a moment to recognize the president of the Central Oklahoma chapter of the Federalist Society, Tamala Hewlett. Ms. Hewlett has done yeoman's work to put this meeting together. And I do want to remind you all that the CLE accreditation for this has been applied for, and we expect to have the favorable report on that shortly. My job, which I am thrilled to do, is to briefly introduce Judge Robert Henry. Judge Henry, as everybody here knows, was appointed by the President to the 10th Circuit back in 1994. That was the last in a long series of impressive elections and appointments that he has had and has had from a very early age. While he was in law school, he was elected to the state legislature and served several terms there. He was elected at age 33 to be the state's attorney general, and served so well that the next time he ran, nobody else dared to oppose him. Shortly into his second term, Judge Henry was appointed as the dean at the Oklahoma City University School of Law, where he served for several years before taking the bench. And if you want to see what Judge Henry was able to do in a very short time period, just go over to the Oklahoma City University Law School and see that marvelous Sarkis building that is a monument to Judge Henry. And I'd ask that Judge Henry please come.
Thank you, Andy. I guess actually the building is more of a monument to Mr. Sarkis and to the oil and gas industry, which has been relatively good to Oklahoma, hasn't it, Tom, over the years. It is a pleasure to be here today and to introduce a brand new friend and also a very old friend. I do want to say, though, just quickly in response to Andy Lester, and since I understand that the topic of judicial activism may come up, I was once accused, Judge Silberman, of a judicial activist decision by some people who didn't bother to read the head notes of the decision, which expressed that it was the exact opposite of what they declared. And although this got some play in the Wall Street Journal and the Spectator and so forth, two lawyers rose to my defense and wrote in explaining that all the decision did was apply 12b-6, Rule 12b-6 on dismissals, which is exactly what the decision did. And those two people who wrote and explained that were Andy Lester and Andy Spiropoulos. So I kind of appreciate that. Just calling something activism doesn't make it such. We are very lucky to have not Judge Silberman, but Judge Silberman with us today. Judge Silberman is a very bright, very thoughtful, very articulate judge. He has had a remarkable career that has spanned a number of different aspects of government, including being both the ambassador to Yugoslavia and an equally difficult and dangerous position, an adjunct professor of law at Georgetown University. If you look over, and his resume is truly impressive, but I just want to read you very briefly part of it because you can see the diversity of experiences that he brings to hand. He was an attorney in the appellate division of the National Labor Relations Board. He was a solicitor with the United States Department of Labor, Under Secretary of Labor, Deputy Attorney General, as I said, Ambassador to Yugoslavia, and a special envoy on ILO affairs. Now, I don't know exactly what he is going to say about lawyers and politicians, but they've had some pretty nice things to say about him. Senator Bob Packwood, a talented person who had some problems that others have had, indicated in his testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee, you can go through all the books and articles about Watergate and not find a sentence that ever taints Larry Silberman. He has always served fairly, honestly, and in the best interests of the United States. Now, a New York Times article, and Lee West, who loves to stir up trouble, brought this up earlier to the judge. A New York Times article once suggested that Judge Silberman grew so angry that he threatened to assault former fellow Judge Abner Mikva. Now, this is, again, part of the problem, Pat McGuigan, when journalists who don't follow legal standards write. I'm just saying that, not accusing you. I'm just suggesting that you want to be careful because Judge Silberman had to correct the Times with a response that any lawyer would immediately know was correct. He said, what I said was, Ab, if you were 10 years younger, I would be tempted to punch you in the nose. Now, anyone knows that is not immediate apprehension of bodily harm, and therefore is not assault. But I also found it interesting to see what some of the lawyers, we'll hear what Judge Silberman has to say about lawyers, but what lawyers had to say about him. They said he is very, very definitely one of the powerhouses on the circuit. He has great intellectual capacity. He is brilliant. He is very intellectual and quick. And one a little ominous, he is very bright, almost too much so. He is a good writer. He is not a lot of fun to appear before, one person said. He likes to ask a lot of questions, and he likes attorneys to be prepared. Now, that's good advice for attorneys who do appellate argument. Judge, we are glad you are here. We welcome you to this podium, and we will, with interest, listen to what you have to say.
Judge Henry, fellow members of the federal and state judiciary, President-elect of the American Bar Association, it is a delight to be here. And I'm going to give a talk about lawyering. 20 years ago, when I was at AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, with a group of refugees from the Ford administration, pondering our government service and the harms we inevitably caused, I wrote an essay for the first issue of a newly launched magazine called Regulation. The title, Will Lawyering Strangle Democratic Capitalism?, may well have been a bit hyperbolic. It was suggested by another editor with greater dramatic flair. Actually, it was Ben Wattenberg. And I've been angry at him ever since because it was too hyperbolic, and I receive a lot of kidding about it. But the essay received some modest attention. Even the American Bar Journal gave it a not unsympathetic review. My proposition was straightforward. Although the legal process, by which I meant all the work performed by lawyers, judges, and legal regulators, and for which the number of practicing lawyers is an accurate proxy, is essential to democratic capitalism, too great an expansion of the legal process actually causes harm to both our economy and our polity. In other words, there is a theoretical tipping point, and we had, in my view, long passed it. Looking back, I see that the themes that I touched on in that piece have been expanded by others, including Walter Olson, a subsequent editor of Regulation. He, some years later, published The Litigation Explosion. Many of you are familiar with that. The tipping point concept, analogous to the Laffer curve, has been pursued extensively in economic literature by Stephen McGee, who's a professor of finance and economics at the University of Texas. I was certainly not original in noting the rise of litigation or in decrying what Nathan Glazier had called the imperial judiciary, which I in part blamed for attracting too many persons into the profession. But I sought to focus on the entire legal process as an integrated whole. I used cancer as the metaphor, rather dramatic, I'm afraid. The legal process had become a cancer which constituted both a major drag on our economy as well as a potential interference with the scope of democratic choice. I used Say's law to suggest that the growth of the supply of lawyers was in part pushing the demand. By this I meant that the demand for lawyers has a defensive nature. Few businessmen will attend a meeting if their counterparts are accompanied by counsel without being similarly protected. Introducing one lawyer into a transaction causes a multiplication of lawyers. The Supreme Court, in its Walters decision, recognized this phenomenon, noting that an existing system of awarding veterans benefits operated essentially without lawyers would be fundamentally changed if some claimants hired counsel. Other claimants, in order to protect their share of a finite pie, would be obliged to retain lawyers, inevitably increasing the cost to the entire system. Perhaps my most controversial observation, at least within the profession, was the notion that a disproportionate amount of intellectual talent for the health of our nation's economy was being drawn into law. Derek Bach, my old professor, who after serving as dean of the Harvard Law School became president of the university and perhaps gained a broader perspective, made the very same point in a major address some years later. I noted that socialism had never achieved major political respectability in this country, and therefore the socialist impulse had been sublimated into the legal process. It had been used to restrict the influence of those major economic institutions that would, in a socialist economy, be owned publicly. Professor Mark Galanter, in a series of articles starting in the early 1980s, implicitly agreed with that diagnosis, but he applauded rather than criticized the developments. Dean Robert Clark, the present dean of the Harvard Law School, in an effort to blunt the increasing acceptance of the cancer metaphor, argued, in a wonderful article, that the economy actually might benefit from the enormous increase in the number of lawyers. As befitting a specialist in corporate law, he distinguished those lawyers engaged in advising or implementing business transactions from those involved in litigation. The former, the majority of the profession, he suggested, performed work essential to the stability of transactions. Their greater need in the United States was dictated by, among other economic trends, the increase in international trade. He maintained that the work of transaction lawyers should be thought of differently, as mere normative ordering, and should not be viewed as implicating the authority of the state. The primary difficulty I find with Bob Clark's heroic effort is that I think his division of the profession into the more productive business counseling portion and the litigation portion is quite artificial. The demand for increased use of lawyers as business advisors is tied inextricably to the risk of litigation. No one uses a lawyer without at least thinking of the prospect of either pursuing or avoiding litigation. If one seeks norm ordering, not enforceable in court, one goes to a clergyman. And once one sees the legal process as an interconnected whole, it should be apparent that its character has quasi-government aspects because the end-point litigation, which takes place before judges, necessarily implicates the sovereign power of the state. I had observed that state legislatures, Congress, or activist judges could often achieve a regulatory objective as easily by creating a private cause of action as would be accomplished by establishing a regulatory agency. Dean Clark also suggested that the growth of the number of lawyers could be in part explained by the increasing economies of scale in the use of lawyers achieved by large organizations. I do not doubt that such economies of scale exist. It has often been noted that large corporations have a competitive advantage over smaller corporations in dealing with regulation. And as I have noted, the legal process includes and complements regulation. But increasing that particular kind of competitive advantage is hardly welfare enhancing. The optimal growth of our economy depends very much on our creating a climate in which new entrepreneurs and small companies will flourish. So much for theory. How justified were these fears I expressed over 20 years ago? The growth of lawyers over that period of time, at least looking at the period as a whole, has continued apace. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, probably the most reliable set, because the BLS conducted a self-reporting survey which tends to exclude non-practicing lawyers, the number of lawyers in the United States nearly doubled between 1977 and 1996, up to 880,000. Over the same time span, the total population of the country grew only from 220 million to 268 million. That means that the percentage of lawyers in the general population increased from 2/10 to 3 1/3. That's an enormous increase. If one goes way back to 1961, the year I graduated from law school, one can see the trend has been inexorable. BLS statistics aren't available from that period, but the ABA's are. According to the ABA, in 1961, the United States had only 257,000 lawyers. The population was approximately 183 million, so the percentage of lawyers in the general population was less than 1.5%, 0.1.5%. Less than half of the 1996 figure of 0.332. It is also worth noting that while the number of lawyers has been increased by almost 100% since 1977, gross national product in real terms has increased only a little more than 50%. It's interesting. Society seems to be resisting. The growth of the legal process is encountering real frictions. First, and perhaps most important in a democracy, the public's regard for lawyers appears to track the growth of the size of the profession in inverse terms. The more the number of lawyers grow, the less lawyers are respected. A 1992 poll commissioned by the ABA revealed only 40% of respondents held a favorable view of lawyers, The only professions that scored worse were stockbrokers and politicians. 56% replied that today's lawyer is no longer a leader in the community. Only 36% said lawyers were a constructive part of the community. And only 22% felt the phrase honest and ethical described lawyers. Just last year, a Harris poll confirmed this trend when it reported that those who thought a lawyer's occupation was one of very great prestige had dropped from 36% in 1977 to only 19% in 1997. That's a staggering drop. And I know this poll is reliable because journalists were rated even lower, at 15%, at the very bottom. The invariable reaction of leaders of the bar to such dismal news is to speak of the need of a public relations offensive, particularly calling attention to the profession's pro bono activities and urging that lawyers increase their pro bono efforts. Even my colleague and friend, Chief Judge Harry Edwards of the D.C. Circuit, who cogently has described some of the profession's difficulties and distressing trends at law schools, thinks an answer to the lawyer's declining image might lie in greater emphasis on pro bono work. He even went so far as to suggest that partnership decisions should turn, in part, on the candidate's pro bono efforts. I believe, and I know I'm an apostate, I'm a heretic, I believe that all this talk of pro bono activities is counterproductive. Implicit in the emphasis on pro bono activities is the profession's acknowledgement that its normal work is not really something to brag about. It does not seem to have occurred to leaders of the bar, I'm speaking of past leaders, of course, that the public's view of lawyers and what lawyers do is influenced significantly by the lawyer's own view of what they do. If one does not believe in the intrinsic value of one's work, how can you expect others will have a different opinion? When I entered Harvard Law School in 1958, Dean Griswold told the entire assembled class that if we wished to earn a great deal of money, we should go across the river to the business school. Oh, we would do all right. But a lawyer's satisfaction came largely from the value of the service he or she performed to society as a whole. Admittedly, he was more than a little parochial about the businessman's role. I don't think he perceived that businessmen helped society. But he did see lawyers as doing that. Practicing law itself was regarded as pro bono. Perhaps working directly for the government could be thought pro bono plus. Being a judge, of course, was super pro bono. Our professors thought the practice of law was an honorable and valuable calling no matter who we were representing. Today, particularly at our elite law schools, most professors teach a quite cynical view of the law and the work of lawyers, at least lawyers representing the productive sectors of the economy. The disdain for our economic system is palpable. Much legal scholarship is warmed over Marxism, with the only variation being in how the oppressed class is described. The oppressors, the analog to Marx's bourgeoisie, are almost always white males. It follows that the actual practice of law, sometimes even for a few years, is perceived as a corrupting disqualification for those seeking academic positions. It is no wonder then that today's lawyers, reflecting this academic culture, hide behind the shield of pro bono activities when attacked. Lawyers see pro bono services as the penance they pay for serving a capitalist system. American lawyers refuse to face the obvious explanation for their increasing unpopularity. The American people are reacting negatively to the vast increase in the number of lawyers and the vast increase in the growth of the legal process. These developments have had, as one would expect, political consequences. Litigation reform, in quotes, is increasingly an issue before state and federal legislatures. I use quotes because I do not wish to take a political position. It will be a tough struggle, however, not just because of the increasingly direct and indirect political activities in lawyers and association of lawyers. Even if the majority of the public is disgusted with our tort system, for example, they may be of two minds about legislative change. Everyone, after all, hopes to win the jackpot. Just because you play the horses, however, doesn't mean you have respect for bookies. The public as a whole are not the only ones to react to the trend line. Institutional clients have adopted an interesting defensive strategy. Lawyers have been hired as employees and brought in-house, so to speak, to staff rapidly growing general counsel's office. It is often said this development stems from efforts by corporations and other organizations to control their fees. But I think that does not adequately explain the motivation. I rather doubt that it has been all that effective in limiting total expenses, legal expenses. As an ex-corporate executive who created a general counsel's office, I learned that the efforts many general counsel and their staffs pursue to scrutinize legal bills and micromanage legal output in excruciating detail are of dubious value. If a law firm's performance is not worth its cost, you should simply get another firm. The general counsel's office really developed, I think, because CEOs and other organization heads instinctively wish to gain control of an increasingly important area of the institution's concern. Any executive worth his or her salt wants to control as much of an organization's environment as possible. As the legal process grew, the CEO wanted to bring the general counsel inside the corporation, as well as much of the company's legal activities as possible. Once the general counsel came inside the corporation, he or she naturally wanted to control as much of the legal work as possible. If only the general counsel and his or her close associates were familiar with the points at which the corporate business brushed up against the legal process, his or her relative influence in the corporation was enhanced. To this effect, many general counsel began to disperse their corporation's legal work widely. They increasingly delegated only specific tasks to individual law firms, often litigation. In the process, law firms lost their institutional ties to corporations. Another professor of mine, Abram Shays, with his wife Antonia, traced this development in a wonderful 1985 article in the Stanford Law Review. They observed quite correctly, in my view, that the inside general counsel and his staff have become responsible for painting their corporation's big legal picture and integrating that picture into the even larger business environment. Under the general counsel's tighter, if not necessarily more productive, control, the senior partner of the outside law firm, once looked at as the wise counselor to the organization, has become outmoded. The inevitable consequence of this development has become the diminished status of lawyers in private firms, even litigators. Today, the senior partner of a major law firm typically takes his or her instruction and provides his or her services to a rather junior lawyer in the general counsel's office. If your client, the person to whom you give legal advice or provide legal services, slides down the organizational structure, your own status inevitably declines. Not surprisingly, this trend has robbed the whole profession of much of its luster. Now, I admit, paradoxical, lawyers, at least at the high end of the market, are actually making more money in real terms than was true 30 years ago. In 1961, when I graduated from law school, a young lawyer at an upper-crust New York law firm could expect to earn the equivalent in today's dollars of approximately $40,000. That same young lawyer in 1996 started at close to $90,000. I think there are two reasons for this. First, the most talented lawyers have been driven by the market into narrower and narrower specialties in order to add value to the general counsel's office. Insofar as they do so, they can charge commensurably higher billings, although the work can be argued to be more tedious. Second, law firms seem almost desperate to increase their billable hours to levels that we once would have thought unbearable. Many of my contemporaries, reaching the end of their legal careers, cannot understand what has happened to them. They make a good deal more money than they ever expected, and they hate what the practice of law has become, and would gladly trade a good portion of their income to recover the old client-law firm relationship. Why, it might be asked, are law firms so desperate to increase their revenues and profitability? There are a number of ancillary reasons, but I think the core reason was identified by the famous anthropologist Robert Ardrey, who you may recall wrote such important books as The Territorial Imperative and African Genesis. His thesis was that humans, like all mammals, have two drives other than the basic ones: to acquire property and status. If you depress the opportunity to acquire one, the second becomes much more important. I remember when I was an ambassador to Yugoslavia, then a communist country, where property acquisition was quite restricted, I noted that an individual's official status throughout the communist world was a good deal more important than is true in this country. As lawyers' place in society and their status vis-a-vis their clients have dropped, they have been driven to acquire more property. Efforts to repress that drive, running as they are counter to human nature, in my view, are doomed. That lawyers would gladly trade a portion of their income to regain that previous equilibrium between status and property is of no avail, unless the number of lawyers as a percentage of the population is significantly reduced, thereby cutting back the legal process. Lawyers will not regain their once esteemed place in our society. Well, what is my prognosis for the future? We see some very recent indications the growth of lawyers in the legal process is slowing down. Actually, this year it's starting to go back up again. But anyway, the number of college graduates going to law school had stabilized. Law school enrollment peaked in 1991 at approximately 130,000, remained close to below that figure since. It is a good sign regarding my concern of the percentage of the most talented college graduates going to law school that for the 94-95 school year, applications for Stanford Law School dropped by 20%, while applications to Stanford Business School increased by 50%. I have to say I don't have much hope for law school teaching, at least in the short term, and I'm referring not to the local law schools. It is dreadfully difficult for very bright but traditionally oriented young scholars, those who respect the ordinary work of lawyers, to gain positions on the faculties of many of our law schools. It'll take a very long time for that environment to change. But the real question is, why have so many college graduates been drawn to law school? In my 77 article, I pointed to the proliferation of regulatory legislation and increasingly bold judicial activism as the factors that promise greater influence and power to those serving the legal process, and therefore attracted too many college graduates into law school. Regulatory legislation has gone out of fashion recently, but judicial activism remains and is still a crucial factor explaining the vast number of American lawyers. For the more the judiciary reaches out to decide issues outside the legal process prior to that point, the more attractive lawyering becomes, notwithstanding countervailing influences. The heyday of the present cycle of judicial activism began in the late 50s, led by the Warren Court. It is stunning, as my colleague Judge Randolph recently found out, that before the Warren Court's trend developed, a special committee of the ABA in 1959 publicly worried that law is becoming a dwindling profession. Not enough people wanted to be lawyers. The Warren Court saved the United States from that fate. Although one hears increasing protest against judicial activism, few signs indicate that it has been significantly discredited. Opponents have been rather short-sighted in attacking the capillaries rather than the jugular. In my view, the core problem is the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is the key not because it is the worst offender. Certainly in this respect, the Rehnquist Court is a vast improvement over the Warren Court, but because by example, if not by direct control, the court is the dominant influence on American judges. When the Supreme Court engages in activism, it has an exaggerated impact throughout the judicial system. Power, after all, is quite enticing. Even judges around the world, trained in less judicially robust systems, are entranced with the activism of the American judiciary. The Supreme Court, unfortunately, has never recognized, in my view, that the manner in which it decides cases, its example, if you will, is much more important than what it actually decides in the relatively few cases it takes. Defenders of judicial activism have been effective in sowing confusion in the public mind as to what it is. One particularly ridiculous view of judicial activism, what I call the Nina Totenberg school, asserts that it is judicially active for a federal court to declare unconstitutional an act of Congress, particularly if it's an act approved of by Washington journalists. Congressional acts, of course, are products of majority will, but the Constitution is a body of positive law that sets congressional parameters. Whether an act in question is properly declared unconstitutional depends entirely on whether a court's interpretation of both the Constitution and the statute is correct, and whether the court is activist depends on how the court approaches its task. A more subtle distortion recently advanced in the New York Times magazine section by Jeff Rosen equates incrementalism with judicial restraint. According to him, expanding the Constitution in small steps so as to trail and perhaps amplify changing public opinion shows restraint. But deciding cases with sweeping gestures ahead of public opinion is activist. Professor Rosen, it should be understood, mixes up judicial restraint with political restraint. Because there's so much controversy as to what it means to be judicially active, I will offer a definition without regard to mentioning particular cases in the Supreme Court, because those cases may, or their progeny may come before me. Judicial activism simply means policy making in the guise of interpreting and applying law. Policy issues are those questions of public concern on which the body politic or political institution have relatively free choice. When legislatures or constitutional conventions make law, they resolve certain policy issues and crystallize the majority view into rules. Of course, these rules are not on equal footing. Constitutional rules trump statutory rules. But what is true for both is if a judge exercises policy choice when deciding what those rules mean, that's judicial activism. It is my conviction that if a judge believes it is legitimate in any case to exercise choice as to a case's outcome, he or she inevitably will be, to some degree, an activist. That is why I believe it is absolutely imperative, as a matter of theory, the judges hold to the proposition there is a theoretical right answer to every case. Given human perfections, judges will often, maybe always, fail in finding those right answers. But our only legitimacy as judges lies in this pursuit. Once one asserts there are even some cases in which there is no theoretical right answer, one is on the road to perdition, because one judge's subset of such cases will inevitably be different from another, and pretty soon no cases have right answers. This simple notion is not generally accepted. A justice for whom I have enormous respect and affection said publicly some years ago that it was naive to think cases in the Supreme Court had theoretical right answers. If cases there do not have right answers, and one assumes that the Supreme Court is a court, then they're foolish to think that there are right answers in a lower federal court. Several important corollaries or subordinate principles guide judges who are opposed to judicial activism. One was put brilliantly by Justice Scalia in his home lecture at Harvard in 1989. The rule of law is a law of rules. A court should articulate the broadest legal principle, the rule, if you will, that governs the case before him or her, and I would add that govern the behavior of the parties at the time they acted. In other words, the rule should be ex ante rather than not ex post. When a court focuses too much on the unique factors in any particular case, it permits itself to decide differently in the next case, making all too clear that it's really engaged in ad hoc decision-making or calibrated policy-making in small, zigzagging steps. Professor Sunstein, generally sympathetic to judicial activism, saw a silver lining in last year's Supreme Court output, even though it was generally thought of as a conservative year. The court shrank from articulating clear principles that would inhibit it from further expansion. A restrained judge will fully set forth his or her reasons for a decision, what Judge Williams has called truth in judging. If true reasoning is revealed, it's virtually impossible to hide policy choices. This is a good deal rarer than it should be, particularly on the Supreme Court. As a part-time law professor, I tell my classes the reason why it takes so long to teach law school students how to recognize the holding of a case is that judges seldom tell the truth. Justice Ginsburg, in a lecture shortly before she was nominated to the Supreme Court, spoke of the virtues of speaking in a judicial voice, by which she meant decorously. The careful use of judicious language, however, is often designed to obscure policymaking. It is often the relentless and sometimes not so decorous logic of dissenters that expose this technique. In this regard, one should also be aware of the dangers of stirring rhetoric. Statements like shocks the conscience of the court that also serves as a cloak for judicial policymaking. Honest reasoning includes honest treatment of governing precedent. And in that respect, the Supreme Court has often been derelict. Shocking sometimes how cases and precedent are de facto overruled without explicitly overruling them by dishonest use of precedent. Now, that's not to say that the court should not overrule a bad precedent. It's to say if they're going to overrule it, they should be honest. And when they are disingenuous, as they often are, holding on to a prior precedent while distinguishing it on ridiculous grounds, they generate a disrespect for law. Finally, I think in a matter of prime importance, it's a hallmark of judicial activism for a court to reach out and decide issues not presented by the parties. It's the first step on the slippery slope of activism. When a court does not limit itself to the questions presented, it behaves exactly like a legislature. The temptation to straighten out the law, to impose one's own construct on a general area of the law can be quite powerful. But there can be no right answer to a question not asked. The entire Supreme Court has been unashamedly guilty of this vice. Opponents of judicial activism have trained their fire on the lower federal courts, but they are not the key target. Even the Ninth Circuit's opinions, the subject of so much recent criticism, find some level of justification in the stated reasoning of past Supreme Court opinions. The Supreme Court has simply been more politically prudent than the lower federal courts. It takes care to issue judicially active judgments that have achieved a consensus among the elite, and it will rarely confront a view held firmly by an overwhelming percentage of the public. For instance, the constitutionality of capital punishment. To put it numerically, the court, no matter how its prior reasoning points, will seldom confront over 55% of the American voters. That self-imposed limitation still leaves the court enormous leeway, for in a democracy, most divisive issues are located, if I may use a football metaphor, between the 45-yard lines. Since the most important agent of judicial activism in the country is the Supreme Court, legislative efforts to attack the problem elsewhere will fail. The court's example dominates American jurisprudence. If one wishes to shrink the legal process significantly, to restore more ground to the political process, reduce economic impediments imposed by lawyers, one must seek a little judiciary. Recall Gladstone's proud espousal of a little England. A Supreme Court that behaves like a traditional and limited court, deciding only cases and controversies before it in accordance with strict judicially principled standards, is an indispensable prerequisite. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge. I had a couple of thoughts that came into my mind as you were talking. The late Bernard Schwartz, who was of an ideological bent different than yours perhaps, once said that Marxism exists only one place in the world today, the elite law schools in the United States of America. Our next speaker is Bill Paul, and I did a little research on him. I found the things that we all know. His partnership at Crowe and Dunlevy, the former executive committee chairman of that prestigious firm, and a firm that, along with Kerr McGee and Pierce Couch, has been the sponsors of our luncheon today. Tamala, I did remember to say that. He is president-elect of the ABA, as we learned. He's had a long, distinguished career in working in the ABA and the OBA. He's been a former president of the Oklahoma Bar Association as well, and has been active in a number of ABA committees. He was a director of the American Judicature Society, and he also knows something about federalism because of his involvement in the National Center for State Courts, something that is important to the Oklahoma judges who are here and who have benefited from training in that area. But of course I wanted to mention things besides that, and besides Phi Beta Kappa, and besides Order of the Coif, and besides his honorary doctorate from OCU and the OU Regents Alumni Award. I decided to interview Lee West. And any of you who know Lee will wonder why I did that, but somebody has to talk to him. He's there so seldom these days. And it turns out that he found out that Bill, whom he refers to as Willie, first decided to begin his career as a cowboy. And he was to ride a mule named One Jump Annie. And he was to be paid $10 if he succeeded. And he failed miserably. And Lee suggested that he didn't have enough talent to be a cowboy and should consider law school, which requires little talent, or to be president of the ABA, which requires even less talent, he said. But the reason for all of this is that Judge West and Bill Paul were moot court partners together in law school, and in fact won the state moot court competition. And it is there that Bill learned the art of heavy lifting. Bill, we are very proud of your leadership in the ABA, and to have a local boy from Pauls Valley make it all the way to the top. We're happy to hear you now.
Well, thank you so much, Judge Henry, for that introduction. Wonderful introduction, I will say. It's just great to be here with so many friends, to see people that I've known a long time, and another opportunity for me to thank the lawyers of Oklahoma for the enormous help they were to me in my campaign to become the president of the American Bar Association. So I thank you again. And Judge Silberman, we thank you for honoring Oklahoma by coming here to address us. Now, I am going to speak to you today about lawyers and the United States justice system. In August, my tenure of service as president of the American Bar Association will commence, and it will extend into the new millennium, and it will conclude with our annual meetings in New York and in London in July of 2000. The American Bar Association now has just over 400,000 members. It is the world's largest professional association. At the dawn of a new millennium, it is a very exciting time for the American Bar Association. It's also a time to ensure that our system of justice, the best justice system in the world, is preserved and maintained. It is a time to ensure that our justice system continues to improve and adapt to serve future generations long into the next millennium. In this connection, I'd like to observe that, in my view, and I say this in every speech where I have an opportunity to do so, the crown jewel of the American justice system, what gives us our greatness, is an independent and accountable judiciary. And the guardians of our free society are an independent bar. Of course, we have our problems, and of course, we can always improve, and we've got to work at it. But that is the bottom line. Now, I'm breaking my comments down into three pieces today. First, I'm going to share with you the results of a survey quite recently done at the request of the American Bar Association for use in a conference on public confidence in the justice system, which occurred in May. As you're going to see, the results of that very recent survey confirm a lot of the statistics and facts that Judge Silberman gave you about the rather low esteem in which lawyers are held. But there's some very encouraging news in it, too. The second piece of my remarks will be to call your attention to what I believe is probably the most important and significant issue our profession has faced in decades, and that is the issue of the multidisciplinary practice firm. I will cover that as the second part. And the third part is that I want to share with you the three initiatives that I am going to pursue in my year of leadership. Now, first, let's turn to this survey that I told you about the current justice system. The ABA Fund for Justice and Education, along with the Open Society Institute and the Ford Foundation, recently conducted an examination of our system of justice. A national survey was conducted by an independent Chicago research firm to assess the public's understanding of and confidence in the justice system, to identify the public's sources of information about the justice system, and to identify the factors which drive public attitudes. It's a nationwide survey among the general population, and it measures the public's perception. May I have the next slide, please? Now, the good news is that there is strong support for our justice system. However, there are areas for improvement. Next slide. The public support for the justice system is evidenced by the fact that over 80% of those surveyed agree with the following statement: in spite of its problems, the American justice system is still the best in the world. And 78% agree that the jury system is the most fair way to determine the guilt or innocence of a person accused of a crime. And 69% agree that juries are the most important part of our justice system. Next slide. Now, to reach this, the measure of confidence in the various components of the system, this is a pretty busy slide, but I want to call special attention to the bars that are highlighted in yellow. The confidence levels in many components of the justice system are high. 50%, the highest rating, feel very confident in the United States Supreme Court. Now drop down to the next yellow bar there. The 34% feel the same way about federal courts other than the Supreme Court. Now let's drop, the state and local courts, the confidence level, that is, who feel extremely or very confident, is 28%. Now drop to the bottom. What is the confidence level in the legal profession and in lawyers? Only 14%. That is below the Congress. And at the bottom, the only group where we are ahead is the media, all the way down to 8%. Well, that's not good news, and those numbers have indeed trended downward over the years. I hope we've bottomed out and we start back up again, and I hope to make some small contribution in my way to that trend. Now, slide 6, please. It is interesting that some groups have more positive attitudes than others about our justice system. Men have more positive attitudes than women. The higher income segments of our population have more positive attitudes than the lower income segments. Older people have more positive attitudes than younger people. And finally, whites have more positive attitudes than non-whites. Next slide. And the level of confidence varies by demographic groups. For example, men have more confidence in the system than do women. That's at the top. And at the bottom, whites have more confidence than do non-whites. Next slide. Only about half of the respondents agree that men and women are treated equally in the courts. This slide has to do with the perception of equal treatment. Again, only half agree that men and women are treated equally. Even fewer believe that among racial and ethnic groups, the treatment is equal. Next slide. But the key finding and the good news is that there is strong public support for the justice system. And the findings show that there are areas of concern among ethnic and racial minorities, as well as among women, among lower income groups, and the less well-educated. Now I'm going to move to part 2 of my remarks, and that is to give you a report on this multidisciplinary practice issue. The current president of the American Bar, my predecessor, Philip Anderson, appointed a commission a year ago to examine the issues of multidisciplinary practice firms. Now, what are they? What are multidisciplinary practice firms? Those are firms which include lawyers and non-lawyers. The non-lawyers may be accountants, they may be financial counselors, there may be life insurance salesmen, there may be any number of people who render personal services. There is a growing and rapid trend in other parts of the world for lawyers to practice in multidisciplinary practice firms and for legal services to be delivered in multidisciplinary practice firms, particularly in Europe. It's not just something new in Europe, it is there. It is entrenched, it is established. And leading the charge are the huge multinational accounting firms. Now, it has not happened in this country for 2 principal reasons. The first reason is that under our rules of professional conduct, lawyers may not share fees. And if lawyers may not share fees, they may not be a part of a multidisciplinary practice firm. The other reason is that in most jurisdictions, there is at least some degree, it varies a great deal as to the strength of the program, but there's some degree of regulation or law about unauthorized practice of law. So that if non-lawyers are engaged in the practice of law, they may be enjoined from doing so because it's unauthorized practice. Well, I told you that there was an ABA commission studying this, and they have worked for a year. They've held hearings. It included some very capable, able, prestigious lawyers, included as reporters 2 distinguished academicians, including Jeffrey Hazard, and they have now made a report, and the report is just out. I have a copy of it. The report recommends what you see on the slide before you. It recommends that the ABA amend its model rules of professional conduct to authorize fee sharing and professional association with non-lawyers. In other words, to authorize and permit the practice of law within the multidisciplinary practice firm. As a protection to the public, to clients, to society, they further recommend that the rules of ethics under which we operate, the rules of professional conduct, be fully extended to the activities of the multidisciplinary practice firm, so that the rules about conflicts, rules of confidentiality would fully apply to the multidisciplinary practice firm. And the regulatory hook is on the lawyers. The recommendation is if a lawyer is practicing in a multidisciplinary practice firm and that firm, the non-lawyer members, violate the rules, then the lawyer is subject to discipline. The lawyer is subject to disbarment. So that is the regulatory hook. The lawyer is held accountable for the activities and the conduct of the entire firm. The recommendation is also that ownership of such a firm be limited to members of the firm, so that there could not be any entrepreneurial activity by people not involved in the firm itself owning a firm and just putting it out there in business. That would not be possible. This recommendation would probably prevent the large accounting firms from further expanding into the practice of law because they just couldn't operate under the conflicts rules under which we operate. You all know the exercise to determine just whether you may accept a case. And if one of those big firms had to go through that same exercise, it would really be prohibitive. Now, I want to mention 2 things. The immediate reaction to this proposal is by at least traditionalists, by those who treasure and value our core values, is pretty negative and pretty cool. That's been my experience. But as people study it and review it, it seems to be gaining some acceptance. The report of the commission, which included people who started out really of a mindset that this is something that has to be stopped. The report of the commission was unanimous when they came to it. There are 2 aspects to this that I do want to mention that not many of us thought of when the study started. One is that there is an element here of creating a level playing field for law firms. That law firms, under this recommendation, if it were adopted, could continue to do what they've always traditionally done, but in addition to bring into the firm these other professionals and render other services, and then effectively compete with the people like the accounting firms in Europe who are offering this service. A lot of clients, particularly large corporate clients, like this NDP system. They like the one-stop shopping. They like dealing with one firm for all the services. And as I say, there's a lot of force behind this. The other element of this that has surfaced to mention is that there are a lot of solo practitioners, a lot of small firm practitioners that, as times have changed and evolved, find it more difficult to have a good, strong, viable practice. Perhaps the areas where they work tends to diminish, number of clients tends to shrink, and this proposal or recommendation, if adopted, would create new opportunities for solos and small firm practitioners, really for all lawyers, and that, say, in a smaller community, well, anywhere. One lawyer, two lawyers can team up with others, accountants and other service providers in the multidisciplinary practice firm. So it is something to think about. Now, the last thing I want to tell you about this is that I, in my capacity as president-elect, have not taken a position on this report, pro or con. It appears it will be on the agenda of the House of Delegates in August. Probably, but not necessarily, it will be deferred for action later because it's so important and so many people in the House of Delegates will, I think, feel that they have not had opportunity to fully consider it, so they're prepared to vote. So it's likely going to come up during my term for final action. So I want to listen to the debate, get all the input I can, and then I will take a position and seek to persuade others in the House of Delegates in support of that position. But I haven't done that yet. And of course, the House of Delegates doesn't mind one bit overruling the president of the ABA. It happens all the time, so whatever view I might take may not be the prevailing view. One other thing to mention here that's very important is that this type of regulation is done by the states. It's done by the high courts of the states. So it's the Supreme Court of Oklahoma that will make the final decision here. What happens is that the ABA model code of professional conduct, and in this instance the ABA model recommendations on MDPs, is most often widely accepted by the states and becomes the rule in the states. But the ABA is a voluntary association of lawyers, and whatever is resolved and voted on there has no regulatory force at all. The only regulatory force would be when and if the high courts of the states adopt it. Well, that concludes my report on this very important issue. I have a copy of the full report with me. And finally, Tamla, have I got another 5 minutes? All right, finally, I want to conclude with giving you a real brief overview of the initiatives I tend to pursue as president. The theme for the year will be larger lawyers serving society in the new millennium. And in addition to furthering all the wonderful programs the ABA has, I intend to pursue these three. One, to improve racial and ethnic diversity in our profession. In my view, we have a very, very serious problem which goes far beyond equal opportunity, far beyond fairness. It has to do with the future of our society. The reason is that the legal profession is the connecting link between the rule of law and society. It's the legal profession that furnishes the judges, the legal profession that furnishes the machinery to make the rule of law work. Now, here are the demographics. Today, as we sit here, our nation is 30% people of color. Our profession, as we sit here, is only 7.5% people of color. And it gets worse, not better, that is in terms of these ratios, every day. we are moving toward a society which is 50% people of color. And we'll be there no later than the year 2050. Current trends, the way things are going now, suggest that the percentage of that segment of our society as represented in the legal profession may at that time be 12%, 13%. Now, a legal profession that does not reflect the general society cannot be the strong connecting link that it needs to be. So this is a matter we must address. This is a matter where we have an obligation to the future, an obligation to those that follow us to cause our profession to reflect the general society by bringing more members of racial and ethnic minorities into the profession. And for fear of overdoing time, I won't describe my programs to you, but planning is well underway and in place, and I'd be delighted to talk to anyone who's curious about it. The second issue is a millennium issue, and it does relate to a great need in our country. Second one is to use the powerful new tools of technology in the delivery of legal services. We really haven't done much to update, improve our delivery mechanisms. And it may be that it's just no longer designed to serve great segments of our population, particularly those of moderate means, not to mention those in lower income levels. So I have a couple of the committees and commissions in the ABA working on pilot programs to think out of the box, devise ways that we can use mechanisms like the internet, the web, to connect lawyers with clients and to deliver legal services, to greatly expand the client base for lawyers, and to achieve access to the system for a lot of people who cannot now afford it. So that's number two. Number three, on the international level, the ABA has been very active over the years, has had a wonderful program in Central and Eastern Europe called CELI, known as CELI, where just great things were done in connection with rule of law initiatives. We have a new council that's focused on Asia. A lot of work was underway in China, put on hold after their embassy got bombed in Belgrade. And what I want to do to add to those wonderful programs is to increase the focus and the level of activity in Latin America and in Africa. And I'll be putting some groups in place to attempt to do that. Well, I thank you for this chance to address you, and I want to close by saying that the ABA is a wonderful home for lawyers. It's a wonderful place for you to get good service for your dues, and a wonderful place where you can participate in the work of the profession, the work that we all do. Thank you, Tamala, so much.
I have been advised that we can have a very few questions of either of these gentlemen. We've covered a wide variety of subjects today, so I guess just about anything is open. Questions, comments, rebuttals, criticism, or great thoughts? Judge West.
President Paul, I understand that in Texas they have a program designed called Advocacy to improve or mentor minority student applicants who also improve the LSA people. Is the ABA considering any sort of adoption or expansion of that sort of program that you're aware of? I think that's a pretty astonishing good result.
Well, yes, they have. As part of these initiatives that I described, we have 3 working groups. One's law school deans, another are corporate general counsel, and another are leaders of law firms and of bar associations. And in each instance, they're identifying best practices and will publish books about best practices and try to replicate them. What you've identified is one of the best practice programs. It's a group of Texas lawyers who just voluntarily, with their own money, came together and put some money together to have an LSAT preparatory course for minority youngsters. And the program's had enormous success. The youngsters that had gone through that course were raised their scores markedly just by learning how to take the test, by getting more accustomed to it. And it's one of the more successful programs around the country. It's one of the many things that can be done to address this problem to which I alluded. So yes, we hope to capitalize on that and multiply it in other areas. It's a great program. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
President Paul, do you have quotas and racial numbers and so forth?
The question was, do you oppose quotas? I should have repeated that question. Do you oppose quotas and racial restrictions?
Well, I'm not really certain that I quite understand your question, but let me tell you what my program is, my plans, my initiative, and then I'll come back and if this doesn't respond to your question. The initiatives that I plan are strictly voluntary. They do not impose anything on anybody. The proposals that I make simply call on the profession to address a problem, to address it voluntarily, and through voluntary programs to assist minority youngsters into law school, to mentor them, to bring them into the profession. Now, there was a question, did I oppose quotas or what? You gotta speak up just a little bit.
Do you oppose racial quotas as a means to achieve more racially diverse?
Do I personally oppose racial quotas to achieve diversity? Well, I don't know that I can respond to that. I personally favor increasing the diversity of the profession, and I personally favor doing it through voluntary action. That's how I feel personally about it.
Patrick?
Yeah, this, of course, the problem you identified, and I'd like Judge Silberman also to respond, is not only a concern in the law, it's a concern in journalism, it's a concern in the core sciences, and many other professions. And I wonder if there's any possibility of a meaningful shift. I think we can make shifts of a percent or 2 or 4 or 5 over time. Can we make transformational shifts without fundamental reform of common education in the country? Beginning from the earliest grades on up, reaching individuals with these backgrounds at the beginning of their lives, rather than trying to take, LSAT remedial type steps. Do you both believe in reform?
Judge?
Should he go first?
I'd be glad to. Well, I think as I've worked on this problem, I've come to think of it as a pipeline. And the pipeline begins long before application to law school. And the pipeline for lawyers, I think, involves going into the schools, going into the classrooms of junior high students, even grade schools, and lighting the fire of interest with those young people about the law and about a legal career, so that those that we would like to see in law school might wind up being there. Certainly, to the extent your question relates to at what point in the development of a person do you need to begin work on this program, my answer is yes, early, very early, not 30 days before they apply to go to law school. Now, the other phase of your question about, to me, it's just a question about public education in this country, and that's a huge subject that I will not address. I will just respond by saying, yes, in order to get people into the law schools, we've got to start early.
Well, Pat, you know judges aren't supposed to express views on policy issues. I confess that back when I was Solicitor and Undersecretary of Labor, I had a great deal to do with the development of affirmative action, which was the forerunner of the term diversity. Affirmative action was dropped because it implied a remedial action, and diversity can be used as a permanently justified goal without a remedial notion. But that was back when I was a policymaker. And I also, as a policymaker, some years later, I wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal, a mea culpa, in which I said I was wrong. So I've been on all sides of the issue before I was a judge, and as a judge, I don't have an opinion.
That's a good answer. I'll have to remember that one. Yes, sir.
Question to Judge Silberman regarding the attorney's infamous billable hour. Do you have some thoughts you'd like to share with respect to the pros and cons of the attorney's billable hour?
Gee, when I started practice back in 1961, billable hours were just becoming the coin of the realm. I remember that I used to think about, my conscience used to be tweaked about whether or not I used to charge billable hours for shower time if I was thinking hard about a brief. There is no question economically back in the late 50s, early 60s, it was determined that lawyers would make more money if they kept count of their billable hours. When I was executive vice president of Crocker Bank, and looking over at the bills, as I said, I stopped my staff from going through the bills and trying to count billable hours and winnow them down and so forth, and you're much better off just taking a gross view from a client point of view. Is it worth the candle or not? The present way in which lawyers are working, however, strikes me as terrifying. I mean, the 3,000 billable hours seems to be not all that unusual, and I think it's a reflection of a very serious pathology, and I don't know how long it can continue. But thank God I'm too old to worry about it.
Anyone else? Another satisfied audience. Thank you all for coming. Tim, was there anything else? I guess we are adjourned.